Up next is a digital painting demo. This demo will be helpful for those of you that are just beginning to paint digitally. And for those of you with more experience, this demo may help you streamline your process. Let's get started. I will begin first by opening up Photoshop. It should also be noted that I will be drawing with the XP Pen Artist Pro 15.6-inch drawing pen display graphics monitor, a cheaper alternative to the Cintiq. Let's create a new file by clicking on Create New. In this New Document tab, they give you several options. I want to make sure my units are set to inches and that my document is set to 8 by 10. You can also play around with the orientation. It does portrait or landscape, and I want to switch my color mode to CMYK. Your color mode really depends on what the final product will be. You will want to set it to CMYK if you are printing, and RGB if this is going to be an image for the web. Now we have a brand new document open, a fresh blank sheet of paper, if you will. I will start by clicking on the Move tool. This is just going to give you that sort of classic black arrow tool to click things. Up here is my color palette, currently set to CMYK. If you click in the upper right-hand corner of the color palette, it will give you several options, including the RGB and HSB sliders. Just below the color palette is my History tab, and just below that is the Layers tab. This is essentially how I set up my workspace. You can edit and customize your own workspace underneath Window, Workspace. I'm going to go ahead and create a new workspace. This way, whenever I open up Photoshop, it will be set to exactly how I like my workspace to be set up. I'm going to call this Jamie. And I try to keep my workspace very, very clean. Essentially, I just have out the color palette, the History tab so I can go back and undo things, and of course my Layers tab so I can keep track of my layers. To create a new layer, simply click the upper right-hand corner of the Layers tab and select New Layer. I'm going to name this layer Sketch. For this Photoshop demo, I'm going to essentially be building a character. Let's go ahead and start by clicking on the Brush tool or hitting B on your keyboard to open up the brush. With the brush selected, at the top of the screen, you will see a toolbar with a variety of brush options. Seen here is the brush preset picker, where I have all of my brushes loaded. You can see I use the Kyle's brushes. I prefer to use his gouache set of gouache brushes. And I have also made a file in my brush picker with just my favorite brushes that I use on a daily basis. When I sketch out my rough drafts, I like using the Kyle's Manga brush in Basic. This is a good sketching brush with a clean edge. It is helpful to make a couple of just rough marks with your brush just to familiarize yourself with the behavior and look of the brush. To undo a mistake, you can simply hit Command-Z on your keyboard or Edit Undo. Seen here. I'm going to go ahead and change the color of my brush. I'm going to be working with a gray color for my sketch. Going back to our brush options at the toolbar on the top of the screen, we can click on the opacity up here. With it set at 100%, it will be opaque, and the lower you go in number, say 0%, it will be more transparent. You can adjust the size of your brush using the bracket keys on your keyboard, seen here. Or you can go back to your brush preset and adjust the size under where it says size. Right now I have the brush mode set to normal. By playing with the mode option, it will change the way the brush lays down color. And as I mentioned before, the opacity, with it set on 100, it will be more opaque. Set on 0, it will be nearly transparent. When I'm doing my rough sketches, I like my opacity to be set on anywhere between 30 and 50% usually. Flow merely refers to how much paint is coming out of your brush. And smoothing is exactly how it sounds. It will literally smooth out your strokes and correct any of that shakiness in your hand. You can see here set on 0, it will pick up every single jittery mark that I make, whereas when it's set a little bit higher, say around 75%, it will really smooth out your marks and make them look more confident and smooth, of course. Let's clean up all of these rough marks by clicking back in our history to delete them. I want to make sure I am clicked on to my sketch layer, and I will begin roughing out the sketch for this little character. I'm going to sketch out a surfer boy. This is just sort of a generic character that I have used in a lot of my books. A beneficial thing to working digitally is that I can make adjustments as I go when I sketch. I can use the lasso tool to select a portion of the sketch that I perhaps, maybe want to resize or rotate. You can click on Edit, Transform, and select Scale, Rotate. There's lots of options underneath Transform. Or you can simply click on Free Transform or hit Command T on your keyboard. This will allow you to rotate and resize your section of the sketch that you want to edit. Kind of a quick way to make some edits, maybe see how things look in a different position. Again, a huge benefit to working digitally. I kind of want to give him more of a natural, more casual looking head tilt. I think that works fine. Now to deselect the selection, simply click Select at the top of the screen and hit Deselect or hit Command D on your keyboard. Now his head is no longer selected. Let's continue on. I want to zoom in on his face. You can hit the zoom tool seen here or just hit Z, simply Z on your keyboard to zoom in. To grab or rotate your image area, you can simply click here. You will find the hand tool and the rotate tool. You can hit R on your keyboard to use the rotate tool. This will allow you to draw more comfortably at certain awkward angles. And you can select the hand tool to sort of pivot and grab your image space. You can hit H on your keyboard or just simply hit the space bar at any time to grab the hand tool. Next, I will increase the opacity on my brush and go ahead and sort of finalize and clean up this sketch. Remember, it's important to have a nice, clean, well thought out drawing before you begin painting and coloring. This looks like a detailed enough sketch to allow me to start painting. In the layers window, I'm going to go ahead and lower the opacity on this sketch layer, just so my sketch isn't too distracting while I begin coloring and painting this image. Let's go ahead and lock that sketch layer so I don't accidentally paint on it simply by clicking the little lock icon. I'm going to make a new layer now. This layer I'm going to name Skin. You can change the order of the layers simply by clicking and dragging a layer down. I want my skin layer to be underneath my sketch layer. Let's finally start mixing some colors. I'm going to mix a sort of a darker skin tone for him. It's pretty much a orange that I dulled down with a bit of cyan and some black. I am not worried about rendering or light and shadows in any way at this point. I am just looking to get down the flat color for the skin. You can use the paint bucket tool to quickly fill in some outline shapes. This is a fast way to paint large areas. Again, I am not concerned with rendering the skin at this point. I'm just looking to get down the flat colors first. I want to create a new layer for the hair now. I'm going to name this layer Hair. And I will ultimately want this layer to sit behind the skin layer since his hair kind of comes out behind his head. So I'll drag and drop that layer behind the skin layer. And I'm going to be using again, my Kyle's Gouache A Go-Go brush. I'm going to go a bit larger with this brush now just to get that fuzzier sort of edge to communicate sort of a curly hair texture. It's a good idea to do your hair in sections since we want a portion of this hair to sit in front of his forehead and along his sideburns. We will have to create a separate layer for the hair or bangs. I've named this layer Hair Front and I have it above my skin layer. Let's go ahead and lock all of these layers because I don't want to accidentally click on them and start painting on them. I'm going to now make a new layer called Clothing or Clothes, and I will proceed to exactly how we did the skin and the hair, just laying in the flat color first. I don't even think these are going to be the colors that I'm going to use for the actual clothing. This is more of just kind of a placeholder for now. And you could easily do your clothing on a bunch of different layers. You could have a layer for the shirt, the pants, the sandals if you wanted to. I will also paint in his surfboard and also save that on a different layer too. It's a good idea to have a separate layer for the background. I should have done this at the beginning, but we're gonna go ahead and put it in now just because I don't like working on a white background. It's nice to start painting and sort of tone your background as you would in a traditional painting. With all of these flat colors now laid in, it's time for me to start putting in some details. We're gonna start by putting the shadows in the skin. Using the eyedropper tool or hitting I on my keyboard, I can select the skin tone again and get that back. I'm going to take our skin color and just simply darken it and kind of cool it down by adding in a little bit more cyan and a bit more black. You may have to test out your shadow color a couple times just to see if you've gotten it right. An easy way to paint within a layer on top of a flat shape is to hit the Lock Transparent Pixel button. With this button selected and us working on our skin layer, you can see now that this keeps us from moving outside the lines. This will allow you to paint a bit faster, block in those basic lights and shadows without having to worry about, going outside the edges or anything like that. I have my light source coming from the top left-hand side, so I'm plotting out my shadows accordingly. A little bit under the chin, underneath the neck. You will also get shadows casted from the clothing on top of the skin. I don't want his skin tone to be perfectly even, so I'm going to go ahead and lower the opacity on my brush and add a bit more magenta to his skin color, allowing me to put in sort of rosy cheeks or sunburnt cheeks, maybe a little bit more rosy along his nose, anywhere on the body that perhaps gets a little bit more sun. I also want his skin to have the suggestion of perhaps some freckles or blemishes. For this, I will be using one of the Kyle's sort of splatter watercolor brushes and go ahead and just put in a couple of freckles here and there. I will use a slightly darker color than my skin tone, and I will also put the brush mode set to multiply. Now it's finally time for us to put in our highlights. I'm going to go back to my gouache brush. I'm going to grab his skin tone with the eyedropper tool, and I want to just lighten and brighten up that skin tone for my highlights. So removing some of the black, removing some of the cyan for a brighter, warmer color. And since the light is coming from the upper left-hand side, he will be getting a lot more highlights along the left side of his face, as well as along the nose and perhaps on the ear. At this point, if needed, we can go a bit darker with some of our darkest details. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that shadow color with the eyedropper tool, add a bit more black to it, and go darker with some of these details. For example, the details inside the ear, the contact shadows in between the fingers and toes, things like that. Darkening some of those details. I would say the details and overall highlights and shadows in his skin are finished. Let's move on to the face. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer for things like his eyes and mouth. We could call this layer, eyes and mouth, or perhaps face. I will start painting his eyes by just kind of placing in the basic shape of the eye. I will start by mixing the color that I would use for the whites of his eyes. It's a good idea not to use pure white, otherwise your character could look possessed or it might look like the eyes are glowing, so I'm kind of going to use a lighter shade of a dull blue. I'm going to bring in the top eyelid or eyelashes, if you will, for the upper part of his eye. I'm basically using a darker version of the color that I used for his hair. I just added a bit more black to it. An easy way to fill in the iris portion of the eye is to simply select the whites of the eyes with the magic wand tool, so that way we don't go outside of the portion of the eye. And we can go ahead and draw in where we want the iris to be positioned. I'm going to have him looking off to the right hand side. I'm going to now just simply clean up some of these edges in the eyeballs. I'm not quite happy yet with his eye shape, so I'm going to adjust that in a second. Instead of grabbing the eraser tool, I'm simply going to change the mode of my brush to clear, so that way I can maintain that rough edge of the brush and overall texture of the brush. And I'm going to simply erase a portion of his eye. This way I can overall change the shape of his eye or make him look like he's a bit more squinty and smiling. It's an easy way to just make a quick edit to the overall shape of the eyes. Next, I'm going to go ahead and paint in his pupil by adding a bit more black to that iris color. I did forget to change my brush from clear back to normal, so let's reset that and try again. There we go. It's also a good idea to put in that cast shadow at the top of the eye. Your eyelid is always going to cast a shadow onto your eyeball, and it just gives the eyes a little bit more of a natural feeling and a little bit more depth to the eyes. I like to use a darker color of the iris to illustrate my pupils. I feel like pure black is a little bit too harsh and can kind of make your characters look a little bit demonic. So using just a darker version of that iris color. I also want to add in that cast shadow from the eyelid into the whites of the eyes. So going a bit more blue and a little bit more black with that mixture. Stylistically, I never really ever put in the super shiny anime highlight, but for this demo, we will put one in. I don't really like using pure white for that bright highlight in the eye, so we're going to use a light blue. Again, it looks a little bit less harsh. And of course, we cannot forget about the mouth. I'm going to recycle some of those darkest darks that I used in the skin tone, and I'm going to add a little bit more black to it to darken it. When drawing a mouth, it's kind of nice to start with the corners of the mouth and then work your way in, going slightly thicker and darker with the outer edges of the mouth. This will give you a little bit more of a natural feel. I'm not super crazy about his mouth position right now, so remember, using the free transform tool, we can mess around with the position and rotate the mouth and also mess around with the overall scale. I almost forgot about his eyebrows. These will help him feel a little bit more expressive. I went ahead and eye dropped and recycled again some of that color that we used in the skin tone for the darkest darks. If you are illustrating a child character, anyone perhaps under the age of maybe 12, prepubescent children, their eyebrows are usually pretty soft, even in darker haired children. You can easily make a child feel a lot older than they are simply by going a bit too dark and harsh edged with your eyebrows. So keep the eyebrows on the softer side for a younger, more cute look. And that's it for the details in his face. Again, on that layer, I have the eyes, eyebrows, and mouth. I want to go back into the skin layer and lighten up some of these lightest, brightest highlights along his nose and along the cheeks and perhaps underneath the mouth. It's now time to work on the clothing. I'm going to go ahead and lock my skin layer and make sure my clothing layer is unlocked. I want to change the color of his shirt. To do this, I'm going to use the lasso tool to select that portion of the layer, his tank top. And we're going to go into Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, or hit Command U on your keyboard, and that will open up the Hue Saturation tool. This is an easy way to quickly change the local color, change the overall hue, mess around with saturation, and of course lightness. I'm going to go ahead and darken his shirt just a bit. I will go ahead and do the same thing for the shorts. I'm going to go with a little bit more of a warmer color, perhaps a reddish pink tone. Again, using that hue saturation tool. Same thing with the sandals. Let's make these green sandals. Sort of a dull green, I guess. You can hit Command D to deselect everything. I'm also going to go ahead and clean up some of these edges. And just how we did with the skin, it's now time to bring in some of these shadows. I'm going to use the eyedropper to select that color from his shirt. And using my brush, just bring in some of those darkest details, some of the stitching, the hemlines, overall shadows. I'm also going to go and bring in the highlights. Basically the same exact approach I did on the skin, building up lights and shadows on these layers. When illustrating clothing, again, it's very important to think about the overall construction of the clothes, where your hemlines are, where your stitching is. Otherwise, clothes can start to look like potato sacks without much detail to them at all. Clicking on the hair layer, I'm going to bring in some of those basic highlights into the hair. I just went and took the same color that I used for the hair and lightened it up and warmed it up a bit. I also like adding in these fun details back into the hair, sort of loose hairs, stray hairs along the bangs, just adding some visual interest. Now coming into the surfboard, again, same thing, making sure I'm clicked on my surfboard layer. I am going to use the polygonal lasso tool to give myself a straight edge, to give me those racing stripes that go down the surfboard, just as sort of a guide. Now that I have my basic colors on my surfboard, I do want to have the suggestion of sort of a shadow on the surfboard, and an easy way to do that is to switch my brush mode to multiply, and using a sort of a dull, really light, dull lavender violet color, I'm going to simply sweep over and bring in that shadowy tone. And by switching my brush mode to multiply, it basically lets you overlay color quickly on top of a pattern. With the brush set to multiply, it essentially makes light pixels or white pixels clear in a sense. It's kind of a fun mode to play around with, especially if you are trying to incorporate shadows over on top of a pattern. I also want to brighten that highlight. You know, it is supposed to be sort of this shiny plexiglass surfboard surface, brightening and lightening that highlight. I also need to color in the fin. Again, I'm able to color that in quickly by making sure my lock transparent pixels button is selected on my layer. I almost forgot to put in a reflected light, adding sort of a pinkish reflected light to that right hand side. On the surfboard layer, I want to show that this surfboard is sort of tucked into some sand perhaps. I'm also going to work on our background layer to bring in some sand behind the boy and the surfboard, just to sort of ground him and finish off this image. I'm using sort of a dull yellow-orange, if you will. I'm also going to go back into my brushes and grab one of my Kyle watercolor splatter brushes to sort of just quickly give us the look of sand, that sandy texture. And I will finish this off by going back to my gouache brush, making sure that gouache brush is set to multiply. I'm gonna come in with a sort of a dull pink color, dull red-violet color, and put in a cast shadow from the surfboard as well as underneath the boy, just to sort of ground them for this simple image. And to finish this off, I will go ahead and put in sort of a yellow, maybe a yellowish highlight or backlight, spotlight behind the character in the background. So taking that pink color, let's go ahead and create sort of a really light yellow and just put in a splash of color just to finish this off. And that's about it, you guys. This is sort of a generic way that I work to quickly render characters. It's kind of my go-to style. So feel free to pick up on this. This style might not be for everyone. It is sort of a flatter style, but it is a good way and a simple way to start painting digitally in Photoshop. Again, I keep my layers pretty simple. I could easily flatten this character now in my layers palette and reuse him in some sort of image. But when I'm building characters, I pretty much just separate my layers into skin, clothes, hair, maybe the face, as well as perhaps some background layers. But overall, keeping things very simple. I hope this demo was helpful and will help you get started painting digitally. Sit down at your computer, start experimenting, and have patience with yourself. Let's give it a try.